The day my husband asked for a divorce, he did it with trembling hands and a rehearsed cough, swearing that a doctor had sentenced him to 6 months to live. I watched him perform, watched the way his eyes flickered to the papers he had planted on our coffee table, and pretended to break the way he wanted me to. I didn't tell him I already had a photo of him clinging to a sun-kissed girl in Miami, smiling too brightly for a man with terminal cancer. I learned to cry on cue that afternoon and promised myself I would not cry for real again. He called me Ira by mistake, first, then corrected it to Madison, the kind of slip a man makes when he is living two lives. He pushed the documents toward me and whispered that he didn't want to be a burden, that divorcing now would free me to find someone better, that he would nobly leave me the house and his shares. I nodded like a broken bird and let him fold me into a frigid embrace, even as I calculated that the house was mortgaged, the shares attached to a company bleeding debt from his own failed project, and the secret nest egg he had siphoned for years was already waiting for his new beginning. When we left the courthouse in a hard New York rain, he gripped the wheel with impatient knuckles and offered to help me if I needed anything. I counted the beats of the wipers and gave him nothing. At the curb, he sped into the gray, as if 5 years of marriage were just a yellow light he'd finally beaten. I brewed tea at 5:10 p.m., steam softening the sting of the day, and stared at the creamed sofa where he had delivered his performance. The phone rang with an unknown number. The man's voice was deep, courteous, and carried my father's name like a key Julian Montgomery counsel to Edward Thorne. My father had been gone nearly a year. He said a clause in the will matured at the exact moment my divorce became final. He said the assets had been sequestered in a private trust to shield me from marital risk. He said the estate totaled $100 million in cash stocks and prime property, and that legal ownership had now transferred solely to me. I set my cup down because my hands were shaking. Somewhere behind my ribs, the last thread of grief snapped, and something steadier took its place. My father, stern, quiet, endlessly protective, had stitched a parachute into the lining of my blind leap. By 9:00 a.m. the next morning, I was riding an elevator to Julian's office. He was younger than I expected, tall and clear-eyed, the kind of man who spoke with precision and let silence do the rest. He slid a thick folder across polished wood, and inside it, my life rearranged itself. Accounts layered like armor, blue-chip certificates blooming with dividends, deeds stamped with addresses I had only ever walked past. Then, a slim second file, investigations, commissioned by my father the year after my wedding, laid out the other life I hadn't seen. Unexplained transfers to shell companies, luxury expenses hidden as vendor payments, a girl named Summer, who appeared in photos like punctuation on beaches and boutiques in the passenger seat of a car that looked uncomfortably like ours. I didn't sob. I let the fury condense until it was heavy and cold enough to carry. When Julian asked what I wanted, I said I wanted the truth on paper, a plan on calendar pages, and Davian Hawthorne reduced to the man he pretended to be when he said he had nothing left. We formed the Thorne Foundation that week, not as a trophy, but as a fortress with a view. I signed the documents at 11:30 a.m., the ink drying as if my father had warmed the pen. I authorized audits of the company Damien had run into the ground and quietly recruited the best talent his ego had driven away. I did not return to my old office to weep. I returned at lunchtime head high to pack a single box and to give my former assistant Amelia, the only person who'd never flattered the wrong man, a Mont Blanc I had once saved for her promotion. In the hallway, whispers clung to me like lint. I walked past them to the elevator and did not look back. That afternoon, I drove north to a new development in Greenwich, Connecticut, the kind of manicured enclave where the price of silence is written into the landscaping. Through Julian's network, I already knew the address where Damien and Summer were feathering their future. I bought the penthouse of their building with a view that skimmed the golf course and settled over the 15th floor like a second sky. I paid in full. That evening at 7:40 p.m., I stood on my balcony with a glass of Cabernet and watched their warm squares of light. I did not picture them. I pictured timing charts, supply chains, and the sharp angle of a public fall. Then I posted a gentle greeting in the residence chat hello from the new penthouse neighbor, and an hour later, A tiny favor about a parking meter, a few coins, and an ex-husband who had forgotten to pay me back. I said it sweetly. Screenshots traveled faster than the elevator. When my phone lit with Damien's number, I answered with the same voice I had used at the courthouse, polished, quiet, and deadly. He accused. I feigned surprise, told him memory can fail when one is terribly ill, emphasized ill, the way a surgeon touches a tendon. He ran out of words before I did. I hung up first. It was petty, and it was perfect. Revenge, I decided, would begin as a whisper and end as a verdict. At dawn, the next day, Julian arrived with numbers that were no longer whispers. The preliminary audit showed embezzlement edging toward $8 million, much of it washed through shell entities and settling into a company owned by Summer's father. I felt that cold weight again. We could file charges immediately, Julian said, or we could take the long way, reclaim what was mine with interest, strip Damien's reputation until it matched his character, and make every door he wanted slam in sequence. I chose the long way. My father had taught me to build, not break. But sometimes you build by removing everything rotten until the air smells clean. The plan needed a battlefield where money timing and public scrutiny would intersect. That came in the form of a citywide affordable housing bid, a project large enough to change reputations. Through quiet acquisitions finalized at 10:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, I took control of Eastside Builders, a respected company struggling under bad debt that could be redeemed with capital and discipline. Within days, suppliers who had stopped answering their calls were scheduling 8 sunrise a.m. breakfasts with me and the firm's best engineers, people Damien had dismissed as expensive ballast, returned with portfolios under their arms. We were not just contenders, we were the standard other bidders measured against and pretended not to. But to defeat the Kincaid Group, the company run by Summer's father and propped up by Damien's ambition, I needed more than strength. I needed to know where their numbers would land. I did not coerce anyone. I found people who were tired of keeping quiet. Amelia mentioned her cousin Joel, a planner at the Kincaids, with a gambling problem and a conscience. At 6:40 p.m. in a diner off Lexington, I slid an envelope across the table to Amelia with enough money to drag Joel out of the hole and the promise of a job at Eastside if he wanted a life he could be proud of. 2 nights later, at 11:05 p.m., a USB drive arrived in a plain envelope. Inside were the Kincaid bid sheets, cut-rate material lists, and a final number designed to undercut competitors by shaving quality to the bone. It was not just a bad strategy, it was dangerous for the families who would live in those buildings. I tucked my anger into the bid. We built a slightly lower price than theirs, a promise to use top-tier materials with provenance, and a schedule that respected both safety and cost. I did not wait quietly for the envelopes to be opened. Power also moves through rooms where violins play and names travel from handshake to headline. The Builders Association Gala fell on a Friday at 8:30 p.m., all crystalline cameras at the hotel where my wedding reception once clinked with toasts. I arrived in emerald silk with Julian on my arm, not as ornamentation, but as witness. Conversations thinned when I crossed the floor. Summer wore a pink dress with equal parts sparkle and insecurity. Damien had the sheen of a man who believes he cannot be touched. When he saw me, his grin collapsed. I introduced myself to his circle with a tone that carried and a title that landed president of the Thorne Foundation, majority owner of Eastside Builders. I watched the recalculations flash behind their eyes. Summer bit first a barbed comment about women who only know how to spend men's money. I kept my voice even and my smile sharp as I reminded her that adult tables require adult manners and that when I was budgeting projects, she was budgeting semesters. It should have ended there, but she lifted a hand, half impulse, half habit. Damien seized her wrist with a hissed warning that said more about their private life than any of us needed to hear. The incident traveled through the room like perfume. I did not need to do anything else. The narrative adjusted itself. I was no longer the discarded ex-wife. I was the woman people watched when she walked away. Back at the office the next morning at 9:20 a.m., Julian spread a second folder across my desk. Follow the money diagrams from the audit resolved into something uglier, nearly $2 million, funneling to a Kincaid shell that paid Summer's father and a separate stream to the son of a city projects director via a scholarship that did not exist 2 months earlier. It smelled like bribery deodorized with paperwork. I instructed Julian to document every transfer, every dinner meeting, every invoice rounded to the nearest favor. Meanwhile, I moved on the suppliers who kept the Concade Group afloat. I offered multi-year contracts with Eastside at fair margins on one condition: partners sever ties with any bidder who used substandard materials on public housing. Ethics and risk management made the decision easy. Within 1 week at 4:45 p.m., 3 major suppliers announced they were pausing work with the Concades pending internal review. Projects stalled, their share price slid. Damien began calling people who no longer picked up. In the building chat, I posted a sunrise photo and a note about an early run. The timing was not innocent. The penthouse shadows in the image made it impossible not to notice the lights on the 15th floor still burning at 6:10 a.m. Bright as if someone had paced through the night. A few neighbors sent heart emojis. Someone else added a rumor about shouting in the hallway around midnight. I said nothing. I went downstairs for coffee, smiled at the concierge, and tipped well. Bid opening day arrived like court. The auditorium at City Hall thrummed at 2:00 p.m. with press and executives inhaling each other's cologne. When the envelopes were read, Eastside builders took the project by 2 points quality over corner cutting. Then, a representative from the Inspector General's office stepped to the lectern with the phrase, "Every corrupt bidder dreads separate inquiry." The Concade packet, she announced, contained irregularities that would be referred to prosecutors, including evidence suggesting collusion and a financial relationship with a public official. Julian and I didn't exchange smiles. We watched the air go out of Damien's posture, and Mr. Concade's color drain from his face to the floor. That afternoon, at 5:55 p.m., my office door flew open. Damien came through the emergency stairwell, hair askew, eyes red, rage corkscrewed into panic. He slammed his hands on my desk and demanded to know what I had done. I stayed seated, spine straight, voice low. I told him that liars eventually hear their own echoes. He spat back something about a scandal 10 years ago, about my father, about a lawsuit I only half remembered from whispered conversations. Then he made a mistake. He said to ask my father at his grave who stabbed him in the back. The line was too polished to be accidental. It was a phrase he had heard at a family table where I was never welcome. When he left the room, felt colder. I called Julian at 6:20 p.m. and told him to dig into the decade-old case with every tool he had. Revenge. I realized was no longer about a husband and a mistress. It was about a wound that predated my marriage and a man my father once called friend. Julian's investigation peeled away the years like wallpaper overwrought. Within 10 days, he returned with files that made my blood chill. 10 years earlier, my father's company had shared a joint patent with the Concade Group. Mr. Concade had been his business partner and closest friend. When the patent proved revolutionary, the friendship fractured. Concade forged documents claimed the invention as his own and drove my father to ruin. The lawsuit that followed had ended in public humiliation for my father, the result of bought witnesses and falsified evidence. The young lawyer defending him had been none other than Julian himself, then fresh out of law school and too idealistic to imagine how power could poison truth. He told me he had carried that failure ever since. My father had never spoken of it to spare me. For a few nights, I lay awake until 3:00 a.m., replaying every moment with Damien in new light. He had been the perfect actor in a play written long before we met a son, chosen to seduce and destroy the daughter of the man his father hated. My marriage, my heartbreak, the fake illness, it had all been part of an inherited vendetta. The realization hollowed me, but it also clarified everything. I wasn't just avenging myself. I was closing a cycle that had begun before I was born. The next move came naturally. Using the wealth my father had protected for me, I began buying parcels of farmland surrounding the Concade family's ancestral estate in the Hamptons, each transaction executed quietly through shell companies. Within a week, every acre encircling their cherished chapel was mine. At 11:30 a.m. on a Thursday, I filed a public request to donate those lands to the town for a waste treatment and recycling facility. It was logical, environmentally sound, and humiliating for a family that worshipped its lineage more than its god. By Saturday afternoon, gossip columns were humming. The matriarch, Mrs. Adela Concade, stormed into my building, bypassing security, until she stood shaking in my doorway, fury making her elegant voice coarse. She shouted about tradition and disgrace, about how her husband had once shown mercy to my father. I let her speak until she slipped the words that confirmed it all. He was a fool, and so was your father. We finished him once, and we'll finish you. I lifted my phone from the table, its screen glowing red with the recording app. Thank you, Mrs. Concade, I said softly. You've just confessed to conspiracy and threats. She went pale, trembling like the porcelain cup she had just knocked over. I asked her to leave. By morning, the leaked audio had spread. Business partners fled the Concades like rats from smoke. For a few days, I allowed myself to breathe. The Thorn Foundation flourished, our public housing project began construction, and my name filled headlines with words like integrity and renewal. But then Damien called. His voice was quiet, almost pleading, asking me to meet him privately. Julian warned against it, yet curiosity won. At 6:00 p.m., I met him in a small tea house on the Lower East Side. He arrived unshaven, his eyes glassy. He actually knelt, and begged for forgiveness. He said his father had forced everything, that he had been a pawn, that he still loved me. I watched him from behind the calm mask I had perfected. When he offered to return to me to sell his family's holdings as atonement, I almost laughed. His repentance was just another form of negotiation. Then Julian entered, drawn by my unease. The instant Damien saw him, his pity act curdled into rage. You, he spat. You were the lawyer who took our money 10 years ago to bury her father. Both Julian and I froze. Ask him, Damien jeered. He was bought then, just like now. The accusation landed like a blow. After Damien stormed out, I turned to Julian shaking. He didn't deny representing my father, he admitted it, but swore he had never been bribed, that my father had forbidden him to tell me anything about the case. I wanted to believe him, but Damien's poison had done its work. Doubt crept in where trust had lived. That evening, unable to rest, I drove to the remains of my childhood home, now a demolition site. Something compelled me to search my father's old office before the final teardown. Under the cracked concrete, workers unearthed a rusted metal box. Inside was a leather-bound diary, its pages yellow, but the handwriting steady. Reading by flashlight at 11:15 p.m., I finally understood. My father and Mr. Concade had once been brothers in vision. Betrayal had broken him, but deeper than that was fear. Concade had sworn revenge on his bloodline, promising that his daughter would one day suffer as he did. My father had foreseen it. His last entry was simple: protect her from hate. If she must fight, let it be to end the cycle, not continue it. I cried until dawn. For the first time, not from anger, but from love that outlasted vengeance. Yet fate wasn't finished testing me. A week later, Summer, the woman Damien had thrown everything away for, called me in a whisper, begging to meet. She arrived, trembling, bruises half hidden by makeup, and slid a USB drive across the table. On it were Damien's secret accounts, his laundering schemes, and most important, a recording of his conversation with his father plotting to ruin my family. I want out, she said. He's turned into a monster. I paid her the $5 million she asked, ensuring she vanished safely abroad. But before she left, she mentioned an encrypted folder on the drive labeled Julian. That night, I couldn't bring myself to open it. Trust and fear wrestled inside me until sunrise. I sent the drive to an independent cyber specialist, instructing absolute secrecy. While waiting, I acted normal with Julian, though we both sensed the distance widening. The investigation would take a week, but destiny moved faster. At 9:40 a.m., on the day I was due to receive the results, Amelia burst into my office, bloodied, terrified, clutching a cracked phone. She had planted a recorder in Damien's office, caught him bragging about bribing officials, But he'd found out and attacked her. He said he won't stop until you're gone, she sobbed. We called security and the police. My heart hardened. I realized the final act couldn't wait. Damien had crossed the line from schemer to criminal. I would end this publicly once and for all. The following night was a gala. Unlike any other, the New York Philanthropy Awards broadcast live, celebrating leaders in community rebuilding. I was set to receive an award for the Thorn Foundation's housing project. Every influential figure in the city would be there, investors, mayors, journalists, and the very people who had once whispered that I was the wife who couldn't keep a man. I didn't plan a confrontation. I planned a conclusion. Julian and I arrived together just after 7 p.m. Cameras flashed. Champagne shimmered. The air smelled of money and ambition, a scent I had learned to recognize the same way I recognized deceit. Across the ballroom, Damien stood with his father, gray-faced and desperate. They were out of time. Their accounts frozen, their company under investigation, their allies evaporating. Yet he smiled at me the way men do when they still think charm can rewrite history. When the host announced my name, I stepped to the stage gold light, reflecting off the chandelier above. Applause swelled. I thanked the audience, the workers who had built homes for families, the people who believed in redemption, and then I paused. But before we talk about rebuilding, I said softly, we must speak of what was destroyed. The lights dimmed slightly. Behind me, the screen came alive. At first, it showed images of the housing site's workers laughing, children waving. Then the video shifted. The audience gasped. Damien's voice filled the room, captured clearly from the USB Summer had given me. Once her father's money is gone, she'll have nothing left to fight with. We'll finish what our family started. His father's voice followed, cold, venomous. The Thorn name dies with her. Gasps rippled through the hall. Reporters raised their phones. Damien shot to his feet, shouting, "That's fake. It's doctored." But the projection didn't stop. It switched to financial statements, offshore transfers, and bribes. Then finally footage of Damien slapping Summer, the timestamp unmistakable. Silence fell like a blade. Security moved before I even gestured. Damien tried to push through the crowd, but 2 uniformed officers intercepted him. His father clutched his chest, collapsing into a chair as paramedics rushed forward. I didn't move. I simply lowered the microphone. That, I said quietly, is how you end a legacy built on lies. The broadcast cut to commercials, but it was too late. The story had already gone viral. By dawn, the Concade empire had disintegrated. Damien was arrested for fraud, money laundering, and attempted assault. His father was hospitalized, his board resigned, and within 72 hours, every property they owned was under investigation. For the first time in decades, the name Thorn wasn't followed by scandal. It was followed by justice. Still, the victory didn't taste sweet. When the cyber report finally arrived, I opened it with trembling hands. Inside the encrypted Julian folder were scanned documents, not bribes or betrayals, but old correspondence between my father and Julian. My father had known Julian was the only lawyer he could trust, so he'd hidden him under false records to protect him. My father had even written, "If she ever needs you, guide her. Don't tell her who sent you." Julian had never lied. He had kept a promise. That evening, I met him on the same balcony where this all began, the city glowing like molten gold below us. "You knew my father's secrets," I whispered. "You carried his guilt and mine." He looked at me with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "He loved you, Madison. He wanted you to live without fear." We stood in silence for a long time. The wind carried the faint sound of sirens, perhaps Damien being transported, perhaps just the noise of a city that never stopped spinning. Finally, I said, "It's over." Julian shook his head gently. "No," he said, "it's just clean again." Months passed. I visited my father's grave on a quiet spring morning, the grass still wet with dew. I placed a single white rose on the stone. "You were right," I whispered. To end the cycle, someone had to let go. I had avenged him, but I hadn't let hatred live in me. The Thorn Foundation expanded nationally. Julian became my partner in every sense of the word, steady, patient, untainted by the poison of the past. Sometimes, late at night, I still see Damien's face in my dreams, not out of longing or vengeance, but as a warning of what happens when love turns into hunger for control. I tell my story now, not for pity, but as a lesson. Evil doesn't always announce itself with cruelty. Sometimes it smiles, swears it's dying, and hands you divorce papers instead. And yet, from that wreckage, I built something that breathes a life that belongs only to me. If this story touched you, share it with someone who's ever been betrayed and forced to find their strength again. Sometimes, justice doesn't roar, it simply stands tall, quiet and unbroken.